Hi everyone, my name's Jim Mackey. I'm the Animal Behaviour Management Officer at the Zoological Society of London. I'm here today at the new Secret Life of Reptiles and Amphibians at London Zoo, and this presentation is called Crocodiles Rock.
Where is the crocodile?
So let's put some context into our case study. So this was a single individual male Philippine crocodile that had recently been moved from the old reptile house at ZSL London Zoo into a brand new enclosure in the new Secret Life of Reptiles and Amphibians. Initially, he seemed to settle in really well, and we have a process at ZSL whereby we have a protected timeline before we open to the public of brand new exhibits. And what we're looking for there is we're looking for the behaviours they would have done in the previous enclosure, which we would consider normal behaviours, so things like functional use of resources, feeding, and even things like training if they've been previously trained, as this Philippine crocodile had. And then we use that to measure whether we feel that they've settled in. We call that our habituation process. And initially, he seemed to settle in brilliantly. He was feeding, he was training, he was doing behaviours that we'd never seen before. For example, this one here that you can see, because the water depth was so much bigger and deeper than he'd ever experienced before. However, after about 3 weeks, keepers that were going up to the viewing windows from the outside started noticing him coming out of his places he was resting and lunging at the window. And it was quite a dramatic behaviour. And actually, it resulted in an injury to his body, to his jawline. And you can see a sort of superficial wound on the upper part of his jaw there. But actually, it became quite a serious issue, and the vets were quite concerned about it. After that, he stopped eating, and so the keepers were placing food in the tank. Normally, he would approach and target train and be able to feed. They were even able to shut him into an off-show area so they could service the enclosure. But he just stopped eating. He basically just shut down from that feeding response. And the behaviours that we were noticing in the outside space, so him lunging at the viewing window in the public areas, well, that escalated to lunging at keepers that were opening the service doors to see where he was and to try and offer food, which he wasn't taking. Now, these behaviours were so dramatic that we started to become quite concerned. And of course, we couldn't service him because the times he was moving into the off-show area previously were through trained behaviour to feed. And so we couldn't get into that enclosure. So we really needed an intervention here. Now you'll notice that I put on the slide here that it was an aggressive behaviour. We got no way of knowing whether this was aggressive or not. Actually, that's a label or a human construct, of course, but it was the way that it was described. So that was a label that we felt it was a useful term to be able to talk to each other when we were talking about this particular behaviour. Now, when we went to do a functional assessment, we realised that there was something pretty obvious at play here. So whenever we're doing our functional assessment, we start with a clearly operationalised behaviour. And in this instance, it was the same really, whether it was at the viewing window or whether it was at the service door with the keepers. And it was very simple, lunges at person. It looked different in the different locations, because when it was at the window, it was often when the animal was in repose, so underneath the water on a shelf or basking, and he would actually leave that location, swim, and then go towards the window and lunge at the window. Now, when it was at the service corridor, it was normally stimulated by the sound of people, of the keeper going into the service area. Then he would swim to that location, hang next to the door, and as the door opened, then he would lunge out of the water at the person. Now, the antecedent or occasioning stimulus, so the things that directly preceded the behaviour, were the same. It was always a person, either in close proximity of the viewing window or at the service door. And the consequence of that behaviour was the same. It was leaving. So the person would either close the door and walk away if it was in the service area, or the person would walk away from that window. They're not going to stay there and make that situation worse. And so we believe that we believed, and we worked out, of course, that if the person that continually leaving then that behaviour is going to increase or maintain in those conditions, and that's because the procedure is negative reinforcement. It's being maintained by distance. So as we said before, it doesn't matter whether the animals are aggressive. That's not really what we're looking for. We're just looking for that behaviour and working out whether that's being maintained by removal of the stimulus, which we felt it was. One of the first things we identified after doing the functional assessment was there was a very significant change in the way that the crocodile experienced people viewing him through that viewing window. In the old enclosure, he'd only ever seen half a person because the window only came up to the waistline of an adult human being. Whereas in the new facility, as you can see here, it was the entirety of this viewing window that he was exposed to. And you can see that there's a shelf here, so people could actually get really, really close and almost look like they're in the water. So this would have been quite a big and significant change in the way that the crocodile saw people. One of the things we started to realise as well is that there really wasn't that much cover in this new enclosure. Now, there were some really good things about it. The depth of the water, the size of the enclosure was significantly bigger. The basking areas and all the life support was amazing, but there wasn't a great deal of cover. However, this is something that we were unable to address now that the animal was in that facility, and we would have had to move him out in order to make those changes. So the first thing we did as our intervention plan was to completely cover that viewing window. Now remember, we're not open to the public now, so we were just doing this to try and help us to work out what the conditions were in which he wasn't going to be doing this behaviour. And so we felt that if we completely covered the screen and carried on with our behaviour observations, then we could have a good idea of what was going on, and we could then address the main issue, which at this moment was the lunging at the keepers in the service door. It's about addressing the negative reinforcement contingency, and we thought we'd start with the keepers at the service corridor. So if you remember, whenever the keepers entered that service area, the crocodile would swim over to the door, and there was one on either side of that enclosure, so it didn't matter where the keeper was, the crocodile would go to that place and lunge at them. And what we were looking for was any other behaviour that wasn't lunging, and we'd be able to reinforce that. So we had two people set up on either side, and we would just look through the window, and wherever the crocodile was, we would open the other side of the enclosure door, and that would evoke the behaviour of swimming towards it, at which point we would close the door. And we would do repetitions of that on either side of the enclosure. So now, instead of reinforcing the behaviour of lunging to close the door, we're reinforcing the behaviour of swimming. And this is what it looked like. So this is us looking through the window, making sure we can see clearly where the animal is, and he was looking the other way. So now we can open that door, and we wait for that responsiveness and movement towards us, and then we simply close that door. And that is a measurably calmer behaviour than lunging, and we are reinforcing that with distance. So after several repetitions of that response there, of just opening the doors, him swimming over, and then us closing the door before he got too close, in the end, he would be waiting in the middle of the pond and kind of looking from side to side. That's when we thought we just want him to do anything else so we can ask for recognition of the presence of food. Now, bearing in mind, up to this point, he hadn't eaten for a very long time. And that was with the keepers either feeding him when they were there or leaving food in for him, and he just wasn't eating. So we thought he probably wouldn't eat, but what about if he was to respond to the presence of food in the enclosure, and even if it was looking at it or moving towards it, even if he didn't eat it, then we could reinforce that with that distance again. And so we used a very large piece of food. As you can see, this is a big quail, and there is a movement towards it, and that was our cue to close that door. So in the previous video, you saw that we were able to reinforce different behaviours for the same valued outcome, which was to get those doors closed and the keepers away. So he could swim, he could hang in the pool, he could look at food and swim towards food. And the great thing about this negative reinforcement procedure is that there's lots of different behaviours the animals can do in order to get that outcome. So it's not just one thing, and we're often trying to work out with positive reinforcement how we can give the animals more degrees of freedom to gain the valued outcome of the food, because often we just ask for one behaviour. And so this is a really cool thing about this particular negative reinforcement procedure. The next thing we wanted to do was to see whether we could get him to feed in that pond again, but still use the behaviour of feeding to gain the outcome of distance from us. And this is what it looked like. So wherever he was, we'd open the other door, just like we were doing before. And remember that we still will reinforce the behaviour of swimming and measurably calmer behaviours than we were seeing before, but actually he started to eat, and this was a really amazing thing. So in the previous video he didn't eat that quail, he just noticed it and moved towards it. But now you can see wherever he is, we're throwing food quite far away from us, we're waiting for him to feed, and that behaviour is what gets rid of us. And so he's now learning that all he's got to do is eat a nice bit of mouse or wiener rat, and he gets what he wants. And of course now we're really starting to see that there's going to be a switch over to positive reinforcement. We're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel here, but now we're still reinforcing that behaviour of moving towards the food. And in that example there, you could see he didn't eat it. So Joe still closed the door because he still wants to reinforce any other behaviour apart from coming too close to him. So we're still looking for those. And this one, the final one in this training session, you can see did eat. So yeah, maybe 4 out of 5 of those repetitions, he ate the food and we reinforced that with closing the door. The time that he didn't eat it and he was swimming towards us, that's fine. We just still closed the door. And things are starting to improve considerably with his behaviour. With the advent of him eating in front of us again, and rather than using the behaviour of lunging at us to get rid of us, we could then switch over to positive reinforcement. Now we know he had a few behaviours in his locker, so he knew how to target train and crate train. So we started using the positive reinforcement of target training to call him into the service area, into the off-show area rather. So as you can see here, there's the target stimulus in the environment. In a moment you'll see him starting to swim over, and there you can see his head's popped up. Excuse the poor visibility here, it's really not a great place to do filming, but you could see that he came in, he took a reinforcer, and then he's back outside and being targeted into that outside space. And everything about his behaviour now from our point of view is measurably calmer, even in that process of targeting. Of course we needed to achieve was to get him to come into those off-show areas, have a slide closed behind him, and allow us to service in the enclosure. Now we knew this was going to be a big challenge, because when he's in that off-show area he can see out and he can see keepers coming in, and so we were slightly concerned that he would revert back to that behaviour of lunging and not be able to get through to that person because of the grill in the way. So we started off by making sure that we were opening and closing the slide with him in the pool, and before we actually closed it with him inside. And this is what that pic looked like. So here he's been called into the off-show area, and as you can see his tail flops off to the side. This is his little cave. Now he's going to be reinforced at a high rate, and that high rate of reinforcement was achieved by using small pieces of meat, so mice in this instance. And we started closing that slide, so we'd already done that process with him outside, a desensitization of the slide closing outside, and then we did it with him inside. And as you can see in a moment, you can see here that he is moving around. So now he's spotted Unar coming into the enclosure, but he doesn't lunge at the grill, he's just watching. And so we feel this is a pretty calm behaviour. Now we didn't spend a long time in that enclosure that very first time. It was only in there for, Unar was only in there for a matter of like a minute or less. And that whole time we are reinforcing with pieces of food. And as you can see here, he's really clearly looking out to see what's going on. And so as soon as Unar was safely out of the way, we then open up that slide, and let the crocodile pop outside and explore. Now, one thing we really wanted to test was whether this had had any impact on his behaviour. So obviously you can see him going out quite quickly to explore. If Unar's still out there in the enclosure, and there's Kim, as you can see, she's actually reinforcing him for going back outside, which was really great that he took that food and didn't want to go straight over to Kim and interact with her. So we felt that was super positive. And then we were able to test out whether that had had an impact by calling him directly back inside, not closing the slide, and he was absolutely fine with that too. So we're really confident that using that negative reinforcement procedure, switching over to positive reinforcement, we had dealt with two of the issues. One was the undesired behaviours directed at keepers, and the fact that we couldn't service. So we got those two problems solved, which was really cool. We still had the issue of the viewing window, and we're getting closer to towards public opening. So we had a few ideas, one of which was to gradually reduce the size and the nature of those barriers until they were basically just low-level barriers without any camo netting. And then we managed to get a contractor to come in, and our interpretive team designed some nice vinyls that would give and provide a little bit more cover from the outside point of view. And this was a really interesting process. You can see here the crocodile was watching what was going on, and me and a couple of the herp team guys were there the whole time watching this happen. So this video shows some of the behaviours that we noticed while these vinyls were being put up. And we're starting to learn a lot more about this amazing crocodile as we went through this process. So obviously this particular stimulus here, well, previously this could have evoked quite a significant behavioural response. So there could have been some lunging at the window, and obviously there's some pretty significant stimuli at play here. So you've got the contractor high up on that step ladder. You've got spraying at the window and really close up to the window. So we were just really conscious that we wanted to make sure that we were with the contractor the whole time. And when we saw behaviours that we thought were pretty calm, in other words, maybe swimming slowly towards us, well, that would be our cue to stop the contractor, get him to jump off that ladder, and then have a rethink. And we started to see some very, very cool behaviours. Look at this. We'd never seen this before because obviously he'd never had that depth of water. So as he came swimming over and then opened those limbs up, and we think this is to do with buoyancy. It means that they can stretch out and sink really quickly. And we really felt that this a lot of these behaviours were really curious rather than stimulated by a fear response. So really positive signs that day. So we're getting closer to exhibit opening now, and we were pretty confident that we'd managed to help this animal settle into the new environment. Now, all of this work was supported by behaviour observations from our behaviour observation volunteers, and that enabled us to really track the progress of this animal. And so we started to see an increase in measurably calm behaviours and a reduction to 0 of the lunging behaviours in both of those conditions. But the barrier to the public viewing was still there. We actually removed it as a trial, and he did lunge at a visitor in close proximity to the window. So we re-established it in time for when we open to the public. As you can see here, the barrier's in place, the vinyls are there, and we're starting to see, some really, really cool behaviours. And as you can see here, he's basking, and you can just see him opening his eyes as I zoom in there, which is always a bit disconcerting with a crocodile. But very, very cool, measurably calm behaviours when we opened to the public. But the barrier was still there, so we hadn't addressed the viewing window issue. Despite the overall success of the procedure, we still needed that barrier, and we were still concerned that if we remove that barrier completely, we may see a resurgence in the lunging behaviour at the window. Then we got an unexpected opportunity to improve the habitat. Now, if you remember from before, these viewing windows here went all the way across, and now you can see there's a block here. Now, what happened, there was a tiny crack appeared in one of the windows. It was nothing to do with the crocodile. It was to do with just something to do with when they were installed. There was a slight issue. and so the water drained away, and we had to remove the crocodile from the exhibit and put him back into his old enclosure temporarily. So this was a real good opportunity, because we're like, well, maybe we can modify the habitat now and do the parts of the intervention plan that we didn't think we'd be able to do. George and Jacob, our enclosure design officers, got to work modifying the habitat to provide more cover and a behaviourally diverse environment. Joe, Dan and the team retrained the crocodile to be ready for transportation in the old enclosure, and this is what that looked like.
Yep. Scales on. Okay, please. Kilograms.
You can see they were able to weigh the animal before he went back to the new enclosure, and now you can see a totally transformed habitat. We were able to use that time to redesign this space for the animal, providing so much more cover and live planting and opportunities for natural behaviours. And because of the enclosure modifications, we felt comfortable that we could now address the problem behaviour of lunging at the viewing window. So in this video you can see us keepers, so that's Lisa Clifford, the welfare officer who's my colleague, a couple of the herp keepers and some volunteers. We're trying to expose the crocodile to the kind of conditions it's going to experience when we open to the public without that barrier there. And we're trying to do it in these controlled conditions. So the first thing we did was Jamie checked out where the animal was, checked that it was nice and calm, so that measurably calm behaviour again, underwater there on the shelf. We would approach, we would get closer each time, we'd add stimulus like tapping on the glass and standing up high, and then all the while we saw these great calm behaviours, then we could reinforce that by moving away, and we could do lots of repetitions of that before we open to the public at 10 o'clock every morning, until we felt ready to move on to the next step, which was feeding. Last thing we really wanted to do was to encourage him to feed and swim around in really close proximity to people, but in those controlled conditions. So prior to public opening, and using people that we knew we could ask to move around as we saw fit. So here you can see him hanging in that pool. We're now going to be doing a feed. So one of those feeds where we call him from one side of the enclosure to the other. And bearing in mind that in previous times this would have definitely evoked that behavioural response of going at the window. So as you can see, he's moving through the enclosure. We've got a whole bunch of our fantastic retail team at ZSL in position and ready to go. Joe does some feeding, so when he's being fed, he's in quite a high state of arousal, so this could be a moment when he would be likely to do some of those behaviours. So then as he's swimming around, we can get right up close to that window, and then anything he does that we consider as nice, again, measurably calm, so whether that's feeding, whether that's just hanging around and swimming, as you can see, then we ask the retail team to take a big step back. And we did lots of repetitions of that during that feed, and we were then super confident that that was the last thing we really needed to see before we could remove those barriers completely. Now what was fantastic was that ZSL had said that if we remove the barriers and he still does the behaviour of lunging at the window, we're going to fit a permanent barrier. And we were like, that's great, so let's just give it a trial with our public around, so with public around watching these behaviours, and then if he still does it, then we can put that permanent barrier in place. But we wanted to give it this chance, because this experience of being so close to the crocodile in that window for children is just such a mesmerising experience when you can get really, really close up. So we wanted to give it that try. And so this is what it looks like now. So now I'm very comfortable that this crocodile has an environment in which he feels safe and secure. He can use his behaviours to control outcomes. And the final tick off the habituation list, if you like, for me, was when we were able to open to the public and I saw these extremely close proximity behaviours of feeding, next to our viewing public. So now we've completely got rid of the barrier. He was totally calm when we weren't feeding, so we were happy with that. We just wanted to see that moment when he was swimming around in that pond, super close to all the children and to the other visitors, and that he didn't show any of those undesired behavioural responses towards people. And as you can see, he's really, really close to the public here. They're getting a fantastic experience. The crocodile is super calm in that environment. He's moving from side to side to gain food reinforcers from Joe and Dan, who are doing the training. And at this moment, I was like, yes, I think we're finally clear, and we've dealt with all of those negative reinforcement contingencies that were at play, both at the viewing window and at the service corridor. And since this video was taken about a month and a half ago, we've had no events at all, no episodes at all of the behaviours that were the undesired and problematic behaviours that were in the original part of the intervention plan. So just in summary, it's really important that as trainers we continue to adhere to effective, efficient and optimal procedures. We know that's often going to be positive reinforcement, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that behaviour is reinforced by distance in some occasions. And if your animal won't eat, now this is a really good thing to think about. How do we address those issues if we can't get appetitives to our animals? And I'd just like to acknowledge that there are some amazing experts out there in the field of behaviour science that can teach us more. And I'm happy to invite you to the first EASA Academy Animal Training Working Group seminar that's going to be held at ZSL London Zoo next June the 12th and 13th, where we'll be taking a deep dive into this exact topic, amongst other things, and with some more case studies like the one you've seen today. So hopefully we'll see you there. And finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to you for listening and taking the time to watch this presentation, but especially to my colleagues in the London Zoo herpetology team and all those other ZSL staff that you saw helping with this intervention plan that was ultimately successful. I really hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon. Bye.